You
All
good?
right, all set.
Okay. So, want to officially welcome everybody to the August meeting of the Florida chapter. We're starting off the year. Have a good crowd here. We got John Paz here today, and we're going to be talking about diversity in Techcom. But at first, I want to invite Bethany and Julia to tell us a little bit about the survey that's out right now.
Okay, would you like me to, Julia, or do you want to start?
I don't have the information up, so could you start?
Sure, yeah. So a couple years ago, we did an STC Florida chapter survey, which we sent out to members and non-members alike, whoever's on our mailing list, to get feedback on our services, our programming, and our plans for the next year. So we've updated the survey for 2020, and that just was sent out yesterday to everyone on our list. So if you haven't already, though I know several folks here already have completed the survey, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what we can do to, improve this year. It seemed like a timely year to perhaps see where we can change and improve and grow, since this is not a year where any of us can keep doing things the same way we have in the past. So if you
Right.
haven't gotten a link to the survey, let me know. But appreciate seeing everyone's feedback. And I know Julia is going to be presenting it to ADCO after, I think, what we say, August 31st was the current deadline.
I believe so.
Mm-hmm. So plenty of time. It's a short survey. There's several questions. We made them quick to answer. So appreciate any time you guys can give.
Cool. Well, I hope everybody is staying safe and productive at home. And congratulations, Julia, on starting your new job.
Thank you.
And so our topic today is diversity in Techcom. Wanted to introduce our guest today, John Paz. Welcome back to the Central Florida area. So John and I went to UCF together, so we go way back. So a little bit of an introduction here. I have some questions that I prepared, and so we'll just make this a nice back and forth chat. And anybody has anything, just feel free to chime in. I want this to be a open discussion. Everybody feel comfortable. This is let's call it a safe space, and just anything that comes to mind, just let us know. So to start from the beginning, John, what led you to Techcom?
Thank you, Alex, first for having me, and for the wonderful introduction. And I love that you put this question first, because you and I, since we know each other, is that I know you know the answer to this question. I feel like you want to pad your stats by asking, because Alex was actually the inspiration for me to join Techcom way back in the day, although unintentionally and unbeknownst to him at the time, I'm certain. So I was already an English major, and my mom is actually an English professor at UCF. She teaches, I think, Lit Theory and Comp 1 and 2. So I'd always been in and out of the English department since I was a teenager, since I was in high school, mostly just as a spectator or during UCF games, or just kind of hanging out in my mom's office. But naturally, I got to know a lot of the professors in the department. Dr. Kevin Meehan is a really good personal friend of ours, and Dr. Applin is sitting right next door to my mother, and he always kind of would ask about me, because Tim and my mom were kind of their friends, and in doing so knew that I was in the English department, and was kind of trying to convince me to try technical writing. And obviously, as an aspiring novelist, I could not think of anything further from my heart's calling. But I had kids when I was 19, and so by the time I was at UCF, I was already in the thick of raising a family and needed to make money. I did not have time to be a starving artist like I planned. So I needed to find something that was going to be, make me money, but not push me out of my comfort zone. I liked writing. I knew I was good at writing. And it was one day, basically taking a nap in my mom's office or something silly like that, where I saw on Dr. Applin's door, there's a poster that says, you're a tech writer if, kind of a riff on the Jeff Foxworthy bit. And it says, like, bullet lists entice you. You find yourself rewriting poorly written instructions for free. People come to you for detailed explanations, even though it's not your job. And it was a hilarious list, but I could genuinely identify with almost all the things in that list. And come to find out, like 2 years later, telling that exact story at a future technical communicators meeting, Alex was like, I made that list. And we'd already been friends and knew each other for about a year or two. He's like, I made that list for one of Dr. Applin's classes. And Applin liked it so much, he put it on his door. And so it was this hilarious kind of roundabout way that Alex and I kind of became friends. And I think, you know, I think we were discussed this over at a STC summit or something.
I believe so, yeah.
Over quite a few beers, I think, and there's a Mary Tyler Moore statue involved, I think, as well. And it was just, it's one of my favorite stories about Techcom, kind of my origin stories, that that Alex plays a direct role in helping to influence in me. Because Applin couldn't convince me, mostly because I just, you know, I think it was just, I couldn't see the light with Techcom. But once I took that first class, it was pretty clear that this is what I was going to be really good at and was kind of meant to do. So it was, I have no regrets at all.
Yeah, because it makes sense, because you know, I always want to emphasize the tech in tech writing. Like you need to be a geek about whatever you're documenting, right? So whenever you can tear apart whatever you're doing, that's where the strength lies in our profession, I think. So.
Oh yeah, and absolutely. And it's funny, growing up, one of the funniest anecdotes that everyone in my family has about me is that I used to break everything as a kid. And it's mostly because I had this really deep curiosity for how things worked, and I loved using screwdrivers. So I used to do things like take radios apart and all kinds of stuff, and always with the intention of putting them back together. And very rarely did I accomplish that. So I knew how to break things, how to break them well and break them intentionally, unintentionally, and that actually proved to be very valuable when I started working for, like, you know, defense companies or, you know, simulation and training, kind of like JHT and some other DEI is another one, where I actually had to work on full-scale helicopter simulators, where I literally my job was to break things apart and document how they work, and putting back together was not even my job. Literally my job was to break things apart and just explain how it works. And so that I realized really quickly that this was perfect for what I needed at that moment in my life, and I've made a good living at it so far.
So tell us a little bit more about your background here in Orlando. What kind of projects did you work at right out of college?
Yeah, my origin story.
Yeah, how did you get into the industry and everything? Other than
I fell into it backwards. It's just like how I had a bit of resistance initially. Even when I went all in technical writing kind of hugged me back, and it was fantastic. So, but mostly almost unintentional. So one of Dr. Flamia's classes, one of the assignments was to create a professional resume, a technical writing resume, and then put it up online. I think at the time it was either Career Builder or Monster.com or something. But that was just part of the assignment. The goal wasn't for me to actually find a job, but I took it seriously, and, you know, I did my best. And of course, I think it's that class that Flamia reaches out to professionals every once in a while to ask you to review students' portfolios. I can't remember which class it was, but I'm sure you all have got the email or participated in that class before. I love that experience. But so after putting my resume online, I think I was working retail at the time, working at Circuit City, and it was 2006. So I had 2 years before I graduated from UCF. And I got a call from Siemens, and I was making like $7.50 an hour or something at Circuit City at the time, which was plenty at the time. I was like, you know, it's fine. Circuit City's an easy job, but of course, I'm like, Siemens, yeah, no, they're talking about $15 an hour. To me, I thought I was gonna be rich. I'm like, this is fantastic. But when I was at the interview, it was very clear I had no idea what anybody was talking about. Like I was in way over my head, but that didn't stop my confidence or kind of my desire to break into the industry. And I had a boss who believed in me and believed in my ability to learn stuff on the fly, because I was I'm pretty quick like that. Learning new technology is actually, like, what I realized is one of my superpowers, is that I'm an early adopter. I like to touch things, play with them, even if I don't understand what's going on. I can usually figure things out. So that was my first role, and it was a contract role for like $15 an hour. And everybody in the English department was like really impressed by it, because I went and found job in the industry, but 2 years left to graduate. And to me, again, it accidentally happened. Like, people were like, what did you do? I was like, I did what my teacher told me to do. And of course, all the professors were like, yeah, good job, John. So all the tech writing professors, if you ask about me and they know me, they have great things to say about me, because I usually have great things to say about the program. But it was not long after that, I got recruited by Lockheed Martin. So I got kind of headhunted to go from 15 to 22 bucks an hour. And I was thrilled with that. Now with Lockheed, the problem was it was supposed to be a 6-month contract. I left one contract to go for another. And the first day on the job, they told me it was a 3-month contract. Oh my God, what am I going to do? I have kids to feed. So I basically was freaking out through the whole contract. And then I got lucky one more time in that I found a role with EA Sports, a video game company in Maitland.
And that's the dream, right?
Sir. Dream was an understatement, because I at the time, so I'm also a big video game person, and my drug of choice is Madden, which is NFL football video game, and that's the studio that makes Madden, and I knew that. Of course, I knew that when I moved to Orlando, I knew that, and so it's like all of a sudden they had a tech writing job open, and I was in desperate need. I knew my contract was going to be over in 3 months, so I applied for the job, went through 2 or 3 rounds of interviews. I didn't get the job at the end. They told me. I was one of 2 people that made it to the final round, and the person they hired was 10 years my senior. So I was like, oh, that's fair enough. Someone who's way more my senior. I can respect that, and thank you very much for telling me. A month later, 1 month to go on my Lockheed contract, so I'm freaking out. They call me back and say, would you like to interview one more time? The guy didn't work out. And so, absolutely. So I brought my portfolio. I mean, I left Lockheed like, I got a long lunch break, and I left Lockheed and went to EA Sports and interviewed with the same people. They didn't even ask me any questions. They say, it's kind of a formality. We know there's no other candidate we want to interview. We knew you were the right person for the job. We just hired that other person because he was way more. You only have 1 year of experience. I'm like, yeah, but they told me, and this is the biggest pad to my ego ever. They said, we wanted to hire you because of your cover letter. I was like, well, okay. I couldn't even remember what I wrote in my cover letter. And they're like, no, you were really passionate about the video games in your cover letter. And this person that we hired before you didn't even like video games. We couldn't get the guy to be interested in them. And to me, that was like, it's like proof to my mother that video games paid off. Like my mom used to always, my mom, the professor, like, video games are not going to be a future in anything. I'm like, ha, in your face, Mom. Video games are paying my bills now. It was great. And it definitely was the dream. The EA Sports has they have a ball pit in the meeting rooms, free cereal, flexible work schedule, casual attire. Coming from Lockheed, where I had to wear a button-up shirt and khakis every day, which was never been my thing. To get to be able to wear chancletas and shorts to show up at 10 a.m. Like, oh man, it felt like the dream, but still very new in my career. So and that job ended up, well, technically my dream job, and then I played video games every lunch break. I kind of felt like the people who hired me didn't know what to do with me, and I was new enough in my career. I didn't know how to be like that self-starter. I didn't know how to sniff out my own work, how to create and balance my own workload, and find the value that my bosses were expecting from me. And then my first month there, my boss took a 2-month sabbatical, went to Fiji.
Wow.
And so my job was to get to transcribe, or he was going to dictate the video game development process, and I was going to write it down and then go to other people and get information. So my source of information left and so I didn't really know what to do with myself for like 3 months working on that job. And if you've ever had a job where you have to feel or look busy instead of actually being busy, it's far more stressful than actually being busy. Like, I'll take being busy over being bored any day of the week. I know what to do with myself when I have a lot of work to do. When I have no work to do, I was stressed out. My only solace was that, yeah, I definitely played video games every day at lunchtime. And my boss, and this is what, I have a high suspicion that my boss, my direct report, not his boss, who was supposed to be my subject matter expert, but my direct report, who didn't go to Fiji, and I talked with him every day, sat right next to me. He wanted me to play with him in Madden every lunch break. And he basically wanted me to coach him on how to be better at Madden, because every quarter there's a tournament, and he keeps getting his butt kicked in Madden by the QA testers. The QA testers just wiped the floor with him. I'm talking like 70-0. And so he's like, could you teach me to be better at Madden? And I kind of was like, did you hire me as a technical writer so I could teach you to be better at Madden? Like, I didn't say that outright. I didn't accuse him of that, but that's what it felt like. And but he was hopeless. Like, so it's kind of, it's a little, again, another pad to my ego that I would just drive my boss through the ground in Madden every day at lunch. But so that contract was 9 months or 10 months. But when it was over, me and EA went our separate ways. It was kind of like we all were leaving the scene of a crime where no one wanted to be there anymore, mostly because they weren't sure how to help me, and I wasn't sure how to ask for the right kind of help. It's like I look back now, it's a little cringeworthy, but I'm mature enough to understand that that's just how it went. Now after that is when I kind of got my foot directly into the DoD world. I think I mentioned earlier before the call to Julia that I worked for JHT, who she now works for, and they hired lots of UCF grads. That was fun. I worked for a company called Carly Corp. I worked for another company called DEI, who doesn't exist anymore. I think now they're called Kratos out of Winter Park. And I worked for another little company called, what's it called? They're in Christmas, Florida. Oh my goodness, TJ Inc. TJ Inc. All of those companies are kind of all either competitors or do similar kind of work. All the DoD contractors, defense, simulation and training, some XML manual conversions and things like that. All kind of similar kind of roles, and all contracts. The only one of those roles was a regular full-time job, and that one I was actually laid off from. So the first 10 years of my career, I had 10 different jobs. So it was. While some people think that's kind of stressful, I realize that for technical writers, that's just par for the course. And in Orlando, that's even more so the case. It wasn't a bad thing. It is what it is. I was appreciative of being able to make money consistently, even in face with uncertainty. But the DoD work was not really doing it for me. So I was still kind of restless, still looking for new work. And I landed a job that I was, again, not really prepared for with a data company called Pentaho, kind of as one of their technical writers for a new product that was doing data warehousing and data integration with big data. I didn't know jack about big data when I started at that company, but again, I told them I could do the job. I had a manager that I liked a lot who was not a traditional tech writer, but was ended up becoming a good friend of mine. But it was my first genuine dip into software technical writing, and that's when I really hit my stride. And when I started to enjoy my work, that I could kind of lose myself in it. I wanted to innovate. I was thinking about it at home, and it was hard. And I realized that's kind of what piques my interest. I like to do hard stuff. And as a technical writer, that's a great trait to have, because a lot of the stuff you work on is really hard and takes a lot of time and homework to read up on.
And I remember that's when I started asking you, like, how can you do software? That was so foreign to me at the time, because I'd been in hardware my entire career, and I was like, they're letting you code and stuff, and I'm like, I was amazed.
I did not know I wanted that so badly until I just had text files that I had to edit into HTML and Markdown, and then that was also my first introduction. The first company I worked at that used Atlassian products, so we were writing documentation on a wiki. So I had like ultimate control. I was an admin. I got to make changes, wide sweeping changes. I got to do the information architecture, content strategy, and it was my first dip in the water for UX writing, although that's not what we called it then. It was kind of before UX writing was a thing, because I got to work with the UX design team to help improve the UI copy. It's funny, I actually have like a bunch of presentations that I give now around UI copy and UX writing specifically. A lot of things that I didn't realize, but I was kind of making these rules up as I went along, but they still kind of bear today. And that I basically would tell the designer, if I have a hard time writing about it, if it's challenging to write instructions about, that means there's something wrong with the experience. That means that the button needs to be named differently, or the experience we're talking about in a way that's too difficult to describe. And that's an indication of a UX problem. And it can be improved. It can be fixed. And they were like, what do you mean? I said, just call this button that, and call that button that, and everything else can be the same. I don't even care what you call it on the back end. Just call those buttons that thing, and you solve all my problems. You unblock me immediately. And I mean, it was a lot of fun, and I loved having that kind of ownership. And when I left that company, I went to work for a healthcare company where at the interview, they asked me, do you have any recommendations for project management software? I was like, oh, that Jira thing. Yeah, that's great stuff. Use Confluence and Jira. I didn't even know how to pronounce it properly. And so they hired me, and at the very first day, they said, what do we do with this? I didn't understand the question. Like, what do you mean? You need an admin to configure this. What's IT? IT was one person. They're like, we thought you were going to be the admin for this stuff. I'm like, oh, I can do it, I guess. I'll give it a shot. And 2 years later, I basically wrote like 5 pages total of documentation for them. I did almost no technical writing for this company because they depended on me to be the administrator for their Atlassian products.
Mm.
That was terrifying because I basically was just teaching myself as I went along. But along the way, I learned to love Atlassian products and Atlassian documentation style. And of course, whenever you're on a company you admire website a lot, you hit that careers portal. I saw this job based in Sydney staring me in the face. For 6 months, the opening was there before I got the courage to even apply for it. Because I knew, reading the requirements, I was well qualified for this job. And they said relocation assistance is available for the right candidate. And so I told my wife, before I even applied for the role, I was like, I'm going to apply for this job in Australia. She's like, you apply for jobs all the time. What's different about this? I'm like, I got a feeling about this one. And sure enough, within 24 hours, they called me back, which was kind of unheard of. And I started talking with the manager there, and within a month or so, they decided to make me an offer. And it was, doubling my salary, giving me a $60,000 bonus, moving me and my family to another country. They're going to pay immigration lawyers, all that stuff. And it was basically impossible for me to say no. And my dad was telling me during negotiations, I'm like, how much money do I ask for? I know this company's got deep pockets, but I don't want to be ungrateful. He goes, put a number in your head. Don't budge. Don't go lower than that number. Well, Atlassian beat that number by 30K before I even opened my mouth. I didn't know what to say. And my parents were like, ask for more money. I'm like, I'm going to need, that's not good enough. And I'm kind of like cringing, like, I can't believe I just said that. And they're like, all right. And so they added another $10,000 in the bonus.
Wow.
I was like, I went to my mom and dad, I'm like, they gave me more money. They're like, oh my God. I was like, I guess I'm moving to Australia. And shockingly enough, and so it took me about 6 months of negotiation. I mean, all the negotiations took over 6 months. Visas took forever. But when it finally came down to it, I didn't even give my boss the 2 weeks notice until after I bought my plane ticket because I didn't want him to try to offer me more money to stay, because my wife and I were pretty sold on the idea of moving to Australia. And so 2015, I moved about 30 days before my family, and we had a blast in Australia for about 3 years. But it was hard being away from home. It was, after raising kids with their grandparents, this direction, the grandparents this direction, siblings everywhere, it was hard just being the 5 of us. Though working for Atlassian was like a dream. It was, at the same time, hard, but easy, because hard is a hard technology I've never used before, easy because the tools I'm very comfortable with. I still work for Atlassian. I hit the 5.5-year mark just recently. I've been here longer than 90% of the rest of the company, if you believe that or not. That's kind of growth Atlassian has seen since I've been here. It's actually a funny stat about Atlassian is that once you've been here for a year, it's almost, because we're hiring people almost exponentially, that once you've been here for a year, you've been here longer than half the company, because we're hiring so often.
Wow.
So that's kind of unheard of growth. But in 2017, we had an opening in San Francisco, and I moved my family to California to get a little closer to home, and to try to kind of alleviate some of the logistical challenges of living in another country. It's just, I have so much empathy for immigrants now, because the amount of paperwork and money and taxes and logistics is just hard. So got a little closer to home, moved back in 2017, but out of the frying pan into the fire in terms of cost of living. From Sydney, the 3rd most expensive real estate market in the world, to San Francisco, the most expensive real estate market in the world.
Wow.
Dubai and Singapore can't even hold Earth. It's just so. So I've been requesting to work remotely to get back to Florida for the past 2 years. And in January, I got a new role with Atlassian. So it's my 3rd different role, but still with Atlassian. And the deal was that I take this new role if the boss would be okay with me working remotely, because my other boss was not okay with it. And so I started a whole new job so I can work remotely. Then COVID happens, and Atlassian announced last month that the entire company has worked remotely forever and ever. So that's kind of frustrating. It is what it is. I already negotiated my way out and back to Florida, so I can get a little closer to home, a little relief in my budget, and maybe go back to school and stuff. So I know that's a long-winded origin story, but it's kind of it's a fun roundabout way that tech writing is kind of taking me across the world.
Yeah, it sets a good foundation for what we can talk about today. So As an American working in Australia, it was a culture shock for you, for your family, for your coworkers. What are some of the perceptions your new team associated with Americans, and vice versa? What perceptions did you arrive to Australia with?
Oh man, I have a movie's worth of stories to tell about it, but the funniest ones are, so I moved in 2015, and obviously 2016, I had a big shock with the presidential elections. And in Australia, politics are very, they're less of taboo to talk about with strangers. So it's like I'd be ordering a burger, and someone would hear my American accent, and they'd be like, "Oh, how about that Donald Trump, or how about gun control, or something?" Or in the United States, that is unheard of, that you talk to a stranger about politics or any of the other kind of forbidden topics. And I'm like, I would be like, that's, it's up there, and I'm pretty sensitive. I don't bash my fellow compatriots or whatever, but it's at the same time I'm like, it is what it is. Thank you for my hamburger. I'm gonna go eat with my kids now. And so it's like the grocers, random people, they want to tell me about their trips to Michigan or Wisconsin. I'm like, why are so many Australians going to Wisconsin? I don't understand at all. But it's funny enough, there's so many Americans that work for Atlassian, especially in the Sydney office. I think of all the expatriates, we make up like 50% of the workforce in the Sydney office are people who are not Australian. I think like 75% of them are Americans. So they're very well versed in how to interact with Americans. It's funny, I hear all the Australian slang, like, it's called ketchup tomato sauce, and they call grocery carts buggies, and there's only a couple of times I got tripped up, but they would like Americanize their language to talk to me, and I would hear it, and I'd be like, hey man, you don't have to like, don't fake the funk. Like, you can say mate around me, it's fine. And at this point, I started doing the opposite, where I was kind of assimilating, and now I picked up some Aussieisms I can't get rid of. Like I say mate unironically now, whereas before it was kind of just trying to blend in and be silly. Now I genuinely say mate. Now it's part of my lexicon. So I don't know how to feel about that. My family thinks I'm a poser, but it was a treasure. It was an experience that my kids will remember. They have lots of friends they still talk to on Snapchat, and we got lots of good friends there. But no place like home. And it was just, it's hard. Australia's really far, really far. 24 hours minimum flight to and from Orlando and Sydney. So it's hard to imagine being on an airplane for that long, and it's a long time. So
yeah, I made a couple trips over to Asia over the last 10 years, and those are long trips. They're long trips because especially the jet lag and everything. You get there, and I mean I can't imagine, because Australia is like 17 hours, isn't it? Or
yeah, it's the most bizarre thing, because like, I think it's on the way there, you basically arrive on the same day you left, though you were flying for 24 hours. And when you come back, a day just disappears. Basically, the time zones steal a day from your life, and you can never get it back unless you go back to Australia, and then you can get it back. So it's bizarre. It's impossible to plan for meetings that way, but people are very understanding. The time zone challenge is pretty familiar to most people.
And so technical communicators in the U.S. often work in international teams like you have before. Do you have any tips for respectfully learning about other cultures, and what are some of the ways that we can embrace diversity on our teams?
Yeah, I think that's my favorite part about working for Atlassian, is that I had so I was part of the expats group in Sydney, which is just a bunch of people who HR kind of put together as buddies, who all people who moved from other countries. And you wouldn't think that would be useful, but when you're that far away from home, and I'm talking about like lots of Europeans, lots of people from Southeast Asia, and lots of Americans, we're all very far from home. And it was a blessing to be able to interact with so many different people from so many different cultures. But a couple of things that are the easiest way to get a better understanding of folks. And the first is understand, what kind of holidays they like to celebrate. I mean, even if it's religious or not, just ask about the government holidays. And telling from Australia, you can tell so much about their holidays. Like my first week there, it was Australia Day. And Australia Day, pretty much everything shuts down, and everyone just has a cookout, and Australian flags come out of nowhere. And it just, you hear Australian music everywhere, which is, you normally hear American music everywhere. And people just, they're very patriotic, and that kind of describes Australia. That you got lots of people who they're very American in that way. And just the same when I worked for Patient Point, it was the owner and the executive, the CEO was Indian, and I think 70% of the people who I worked with there and in our offshore company in India were all of Indian descent, like from India or Indian American, born in America and Indian descent. And so we celebrated all the U.S. bank holidays and all the Indian holidays as well. So I became a connoisseur of Indian food, and they loved to see what kind of, I wouldn't know what things were called, but I'm always up for challenging dishes. And the Indian spicy is very different from Latino spicy. I learned that, and you can get a burn in your mouth that it's hard to get rid of. But the culture was so welcoming, and they loved explaining the different holidays, and so it now becomes part of my way of interacting with another culture, is trying to make sure that I'm there during a festival or a celebration of some sort, and it'll tell you a lot about what they care about and what's important to them. I think that's how you make connections.
I think the common denominator there is food, right?
Oh yeah,
always
food.
I was always a fan of Anthony Bourdain. Him going all over the world, sharing a meal wherever he went with the locals. I think that was important.
Yeah, man. And I'll tell you what, of Australia, I mean, their national dishes, like the things they're known for. You never hear Australian cuisine. If I actually name something, you'd say a bloomin' onion or something, which is not even Australian. But their national dishes are like sausages and meat pies and Italian food like spaghetti and stuff. And so it's just, it's kind of a melting pot, just like America is. But it tells you a lot about the Australian culture, that it's essentially European.
And so you mentioned the Bay Area earlier is the most expensive real estate market in the country, possibly the world. So how deep is the tech divide, and what sort of barriers of entry do people of color or lower socioeconomic groups face into getting into the tech industry?
It's hard to describe, and it's impossible to overstate. It's on full display in the Bay Area, so the Atlassian's offices are in San Francisco, the city, and I lived in the East Bay, in a little city called Dublin. It's 30 minutes south of Oakland, 20 minutes south of Berkeley, but I rode the train every day. And the BART train, Bay Area Rapid Transit, is the great equalizer, and that you see people with button-up $1,000 suits, and you see homeless people who smell just as bad as they look. And it is, of course, I had a flexible schedule, so I purposely would try to avoid the rush, so I wouldn't have to stand the whole way, because there's an hour there, an hour back. Which for people in Florida seems like it's insane. We were talking about commutes earlier, and I commuted every day, an hour each way. And I could have worked remotely from home, but a new team, I wanted to be in the office. Plus, I didn't have a home office in my new rental, so I liked going into the office. But I saw some of the craziest stuff I've ever seen in my life. And I mean, and this is, I don't like to rag on the city of San Francisco because it does a lot of things right. And especially because in Florida, you got a lot of people who like to think that, they throw quotes up in the air and call it liberal utopia and think that it's kind of the bastion for progressive policies. And they've all failed because of all this crazy stuff happens in San Francisco. Not to get political about it, but it's far more nuanced than that. And San Francisco does a lot more with a lot less than most cities could ever dream of. But at the same time, it was just my first day in San Francisco. Coming out of the train system, I hopped up out of in the Tenderloin, which is like the most notorious neighborhood in San Francisco, and within 30 seconds, I saw someone shooting heroin into their leg on the side of the street. And it was, I mean, you can tell that I was not the local, because I was like, what the heck is going on? And I even went to a police officer and kind of gave me a quick, nudge. I'm like, hey, I'm not trying to get my boy in trouble over there, but feel like someone should probably say something. And the cop was like, it's not my jurisdiction. That's Bay Area Transit. They got to deal with that. I can't do nothing about it. And didn't even blink to a person shooting up heroin on the side of the street. And so this kind of disparity is on full display every day in San Francisco. And it's to see this kind of unimaginable wealth. You have literal millionaires stepping over homeless people who've lived in the city their whole life. it's hard to reckon with. It's in the kind of guilt and survivor's guilt you feel every day is real. Although it's easy to look past because people fear for their safety, and especially women walking around by themselves at night. You have these homeless people who are, or people suffering from homelessness is actually probably the more correct term. A lot of them dealing with addiction problems, with mental health problems, and no jobs in sight, because it's like within a decade the middle class in the Bay Area was wiped out. And it has everything to do with the tech boom, where you have the Ubers, the Facebooks, Googles of the world move in, buy up the most expensive real estate in the world to make it more expensive, and then pay their engineers and talent more than any other place in the world to get them there to Silicon Valley. And it works. There's now more engineers per capita there probably than any other place in the world. But what they do is they push out regular people, the service staff. They push out, nurses, doctors. Not maybe less so doctors and surgeons, but the nurses, the executives, the executive assistants, and all those people who support them. It becomes impossible for them to survive. I mean, in the East Bay where I lived, in Oakland in particular, a family of 4 making $115,000 a year can still qualify for food stamps, because of the disparity in cost of living. That's hard to fathom there. So even though I was making the most money in my life, it was still paying the bills was not trivial. It was still required some finessing. The digital divide is on full display, and that you have these tech companies who talk about being so desperate for diversity. Oh, how do the tech pipeline? If only minorities cared about tech, and that's bullshit. Like you can walk right outside and you can set up a stand saying, teach anybody to code and we'll give you an apprenticeship, and you're not doing that. And so it's like, I have a couple of presentations. One that I'm giving to Button Conference in October, which I'm the first ever content design conference. It'll be on diversity, and it's a combination of 2 presentations I've given before. And the title is, the pipeline problem and other myths about workplace diversity. It's because tech's problem with diversity is deeper than just minorities don't have access to tech. It's much deeper than that. There's all kinds of systemic biases in play that they're kind of fooling themselves about. And the exhibit A for that is San Francisco. And that you have these people who've never had real jobs. In my mind, a real job is a 9-to-5 you have to show up for, that doesn't pay you enough, that you only kind of like. That in my mind is a real job. Everybody on this call, I'm certain, has probably had a real job. Whereas when you work in tech, you get free food. You have Google shuttles that take you from the train to your office front door, so you don't ever have to see the locals in San Francisco. And it's a sanitized experience that is bizarre, and for people who aren't from there, it causes you all kinds of anxiety and guilt, because it's not right. Like, you should be contributing to the local economy. You should be uplifting the people around you who are helping you get rich. But instead, the gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and now it feels like it's insurmountable. And the people around town, it's the animosity towards techies is palpable. You can taste it when you're on the trains. When you see the techie with their headphones on, not paying attention to anything around them, eyes in the phone, clearly dressed in casual attire or with their hoodie on. Like the hoodies in the Bay Area are strategic because it's cold all the time, and so you can point out a techie from a mile away, and you can also at the same time point out a non-techie, because they're usually the ones who are angry at the techies, buying up everything, using up all the space, and not really contributing back to the local economy. Gentrification there is real, and that you have placed a historically black city like Oakland that is now considered rich, posh neighborhood, because people bought up this beautiful land that black folks been on for 60 to 70 years now, and just outbid everybody. And now because they can afford it, these historically black families who've owned these homes for 60, 70 years now find themselves on the wrong side of the digital divide. And it's tragic, and it's avoidable. And that's why I kind of made it my mission to kind of talk about diversity topics. And I do it from a Techcom angle. And nobody thinks it's fun talking about these kinds of topics on a regular basis. It's challenging, and it's heart-wrenching in some cases, but it's important. And I feel like I'm a recipient of a lot of advocacy and change. So I feel like paying it forward is important to me, if only for my own, for my soul. So it's a soapbox I will stand up on top of every opportunity I get, if only because no one else in tech is doing it right just yet.
And I think that's why we're here, to have these kind of difficult conversations, right, and continue the conversation. And so what can employers and universities do better in these aspects to close that gap?
Yeah. So the first, and it's the hardest to convince people of, so you have to convince people that diversity is worth doing and that it's something that will take a dedicated effort. And for a lot of managers, CEOs, business owners, they need to be convinced from a dollars perspective, from a revenue perspective, ROI. That's what they care about. I understand you're a business owner, you got people to feed, you got employees depending on you to make money. So doing it because it's the right thing is not enough for some of these folks. At this point, the demographics, and at least in the United States, the demographics are clear that without a diverse workforce, you're missing out on genuine financial opportunities. You're missing out on being able to relate to overwhelming majority by, I think by 2022, it's supposed to be that minorities will be the majority if they aren't already in the United States. So it's like, it's from a logistical perspective, you stand to benefit from hiring a diverse workforce. So it's like there's all kinds of studies that have been put out. They also say that homogeneous workforces don't do as well as diverse workforces, not just in productivity and industrialness, but in creative output. They come up with more innovative solutions, they get blocked less quickly, and they have a higher job satisfaction rate. Nobody wants to work with a yes person. Nobody wants to work with someone who's not going to help you get better or reach new highs. You limit yourself by keeping the people around you who think just like you. So it's, you have to make the business case for diversity first and foremost, and it has to become something that your company values. And so a lot of companies should want to tick a box and say they have a diverse workforce, and don't want to put in the work to recruit and retain a diverse workforce. So it's hard because that feels insurmountable sometimes, but it's there. You just have to keep having the conversations. But there's lots of things you can do, practical things. Like, I'm like, there's what, 100 and something historically Black colleges and universities in the United States of America. I don't want to hear anybody talk about you can't find Black engineers, you can't find Black technical people. Like, African Americans make up between 13 and 16% of the United States population, but yet, upwards of between 6 and 10% of engineering degrees are awarded to African Americans, people who identify as Black. And yet, high tech companies, quote unquote high tech companies, the Facebook, Googles of the world, the software companies, basically, when I say tech companies, that's what I'm talking about, their numbers are abysmal. They have like less than 1% of their technical workforce identify as Black or African American. Like, what is the excuse for that? And it's pretty clear. It's because A, they have a lot of bias and systemic bias in their hiring processes and recruiting processes. They don't look at places where Black folks live. Silicon Valley is not where Black folks live because it's unreasonable to live there. So, but yet they don't open many headquarters in Atlanta or in the South, or they don't set up recruiting booths at HBCUs. And so, because they're not recruiting actively, their numbers are low. And they're like, oh, why are our numbers so low? Why don't Black people want to work for us? It's because you don't have a lot of Black people that work for you. Nobody likes being the first at anything. Like, yeah, sure, you want to put that on a plaque and get awards for it, but if that doesn't mean more money, it's not useful, because it's stressful being the only Black person in the room. And right off the bat, tech has got a reputation for being toxic towards minorities, Black women in particular. Why would a Black woman want to put herself through that? It's unheard of, and no one wants to have to demand respect every single day. And when you have engineers or other technical people who you need to prove yourself to, it's exhausting, and tech has that reputation. So it's like, you have to make it a place where people can feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, and a place where their opinions are valued. And there's all kinds of ways you can do that, but it starts with respect. And until you find a way to build that into your company culture, you're always going to have a recruiting and retention problem with minorities, because we don't got time for that anymore. And we know our worth, and so we'll go where the money is and for people who respect us.
Absolutely. And so I'll just give a little bit of a disclaimer here. Obviously, these are my views and not Lockheed Martin's. Let's say major corporations have employee resource groups to attempt to embrace diversity and inclusion. So in my case, I get to celebrate the various intersectionalities that make me who I am. I'm a member of the 3 ERGs at Lockheed Martin. the Pride ERG, the Hispanic OLA, which celebrate my sexual orientation and heritage, and also the Professional Asian American Network, which is to celebrate my husband's Vietnamese heritage. And so these groups, I believe, are important for being able to bring your entire self to work. Do you think these types of groups are important in other companies, and why are they so important? What do they bring to the table, and do they allow minorities and people who are not usually represented to see themselves in that company?
Yeah, that's a so ERGs are they're a lovely kind of oasis of familiarity in kind of, you know, this ocean of uncertainty and unfamiliar territory. Now, when I read your question, I remembered that at some point I'm less active in the ERGs in Atlassian now that I'm remote. Obviously, it's a little more difficult for me to participate, especially because I'm in the East Coast time zone. They're all West Coast based. And I've just been relocating, been busy, haven't had an opportunity to catch up with a lot of those folks. But I'm okay with that. And that is an important thing about an ERG as well, is that ERGs are only useful if people want them. And
right.
No minority wants to be pushed into some place just like, you're black, I'm black, let's be friends. Like, no, that is the fastest way so that we won't want to talk to each other because that's awkward. Nobody wants to be, when the other black person in the office, when we make eye contact, we want to have something else to talk about besides us just being black.
Right.
Now, with that being said, ERGs have to always be an option. And HR has a responsibility to make sure that everyone's aware that if you want this, which is, dedicated space, dedicated time, permission, and any other kind of resources that you need. Exactly. You have to put your money where your mouth is. That if an employee asks for it, even if they're the only black person, that means they want to be able to stake their claim that their identity exists here. And if that's important to them, it should be important to the company as well. Just the same, the expectation is that you tell them that it exists, but that there's no expectation you join, obviously. And the only reason why I think that's important to point out is that when I was really active in the Black Atlassian group, I'm also kind of, I was told you I was part of the expats group as well. So I thought I kind of look at myself a little ambassador for Black folks when they join Atlassian. And I hadn't met anyone who kind of didn't want to be a part of the ERG before, except for when I met this older woman who was actually, a couple pay levels above me, and she wanted nothing to do with it, wanted nothing to do with the ERG. And I was shocked and surprised, and I'm not going to fault her for that. I'm not going to hold anything against her from that. But she's like, nope, I just want to come here, do my job, and go home. I was like, all right, I guess I'll see you around. And she still says hi to me when I see her in the hallways, and we're still, cordial. If she ever needed something, we don't work in the same group right now, so I don't ever see her. But it kind of, all the other people in the ERGs are, we're all around probably similar age range, probably all millennials, probably all, either engineers or work with engineers, some designers, some support people. So we all connect on a lot of different levels. This woman worked in the executive team, and she didn't really relate to a lot of us and just had no interest in it. And I couldn't fault her for it. But I hadn't considered that before. When I was talking with other folks in the group and saying, do we have an obligation to be here? And I know that no one has a physical obligation, but I always felt a sense of personal obligation, moral obligation to participate. But right away they're like, oh no, if I didn't want to be here, I wouldn't be here. I don't feel like I owe anybody anything. I'm here because I like you all. So I felt like at some point I needed to reevaluate my priorities about my obligation to myself and to, essentially my people, and that it was costing me a lot of time to participate in these things, and you don't have a lot of time. So I had to pull back on some of that stuff. So I think it's, but when I lived in Australia, it was really important for me to connect with a handful of other Black folks that lived and worked for Atlassian over there. And whenever they would come in from out of town, I'd always show them around, and we're still good friends. So that was really important when I was kind of isolated in Australia. I say isolated, Sydney's a place of 10 million people, something like that. It's not really isolated, but I felt isolated because I was the only one to look like me. And I was very different than everybody else. And that was the first time in my life I'd ever been that way. I grew up in St. Louis, where, identified as black, and people treated me like I was black, and then I moved to Pittsburgh, and nobody thought I was black, and I didn't understand that because all my family's black. Like, I don't see my family. They're like, yeah, but you look different than the rest of your family does. So and then I moved to Florida, and everybody called me Puerto Rican. And I was like, okay, I don't even know what Puerto Rican is at this point. So everybody keep calling me that. And then my friend, who I've been friends with for a week, he was like, bro, we look like we could be brothers. I'm like, yeah, I thought that's just how people look sometimes. He goes, everybody thinks that you're Puerto Rican. I'm like, oh, that's because we look alike. Yeah. And I looked around, I look very Puerto Rican. And my wife is Puerto Rican. So I got Puerto Rican babies. And so they're just confused. And so it's important to have people that you can identify with and be your true self at. But if the world was perfect, we wouldn't need the ERGs to feel that way, because there'd be representation on every team, and that people would just expect to include you with things and invite you to things. But that's not the case. So ERGs are a way to kind of supplement that gap in kind of sympathy and empathy.
Absolutely, and I think they give you a place at the table with executives.
Yes.
Because I know in a company as big as Lockheed Martin, over 120,000 employees around the world, each of the ERGs has an opportunity at least once a year to hold a convention at headquarters, and with executive presence and being able to have that, like I said, place at the table to talk about these issues. Like in my case, I always say coming out is a constant. There's inherent biases in societies that you're just like, oh, this is your sexual orientation. Okay, well, yeah, I hadn't expected that, for example. Like, so
Yeah.
you're always coming out. It's the use of pronouns, or it's the use of my significant other, my husband, right? And then people will assume, oh, what does your wife do? No, I have a husband, and you always have to. It's always, whenever you're meeting new people, you're always coming out, or everybody arrives at the table with different backgrounds, and that's what drives our motivations, right?
No, you're spot on, man. And I'll tell you what, that I'm not, the Me Too movement and kind of the LGBTQ movements, about regularize, making it commonplace to speak your pronouns and to request that people use the proper pronouns that you prefer. Like, that was something that was hard to understand at first, because from a language perspective, I needed to understand the mechanics behind using they instead of he or her.
Yep.
And in San Francisco, of course, that's not just a topic of conversation. That's a way of life. Like, people, even in my kids' high schools, I have high school kids. The high school kids didn't tolerate bullying of homosexual people or people who were trans or people who just preferred to use a gender neutral pronoun. And that was like, the kids sticking up for other kids. And that's so different from even just 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when some of us were younger. So it's a beautiful thing to see, but you realize that it doesn't cost us anything to just be a little more thoughtful and to try a little harder to think that there's people out there who aren't like you, and that's not that okay, but you should anticipate that and plan for it. And it's not going to cost you anything to say. And in Australia, everybody says partner anyway. Like, and started with people, I think in the 60s and 70s, people were kind of refusing to get married and just living with their boyfriends and girlfriends. So people stopped saying husband and wives a long time ago. They just say your partner, and partner has got no assumption behind it. You say partner for people who for husband and wife, for boyfriend and girlfriend, for lesbians, homosexuals, anything. You say partner. You say, oh, is your partner coming? Is your partner going to show up? And there's no assumption behind it. And I think it's an important fact to know that language means something to people, and it's important that you have to go where people are and stop asking people to change to accommodate just some word changes, you know. And so I hope to my diversity talk at Button in October is very much around the pipeline theme I was talking about earlier: hiring, feeling of inclusion, belonging. I'm going to hit all the notes from before, but this target audience that I'm talking to, content designers and technical writers, I think we play a unique role in championing diversity efforts and inclusive terminology. And that, you know, we're supposed to be the gatekeepers for words and terminology, and we are almost always defined as some of the closest and most passionate user and customer advocates. That we want our customers to get the job done at whatever cost it takes. If it means that the product has to change so that my customers can do what they're supposed to do, what we promised them that they can do, we should do that. In just the same way, we should try to make error messages be relevant for people who aren't engineers. We should try to make, we should try to make terminology decisions that make sense to people who might not work in tech. We should try to include step-by-step instructions on everything. We should always have tooltips on our buttons so that people using screen readers can actually interact with our programs. These are things that cost us time, effort, and planning up front. But for someone who depends on these things, it makes all the difference in the world, and we can play a role in that. And so I feel like it's a timely topic. I was really happy when you decided to kind of talk about a diversity topic here, and it's it means the world to some people, and we play an important role as writers.
Absolutely, it's like I said, it's important to have these conversations. So Bethany, in the chat, has there been some good back and forth?
Yeah, I certainly think there has. Miranda's been making lots of good points, which I mostly am like, yes, you're definitely right about that. We're talking about kind of the demographics of Techcom right now, and also Julia shared a resource on the ABCs of LGBT+ that she recommended, kind of relating to that earlier. But we were talking about Saul Carliner's study, which I think he presented at the summit a couple years ago. And I just double checked, 81% of the people who responded to the survey were white. And
what was that? I'm so curious.
What'd you say? I'm sorry, I cut off the first part.
Do you know what year that was?
Let me find where the year was. I think it was something they did earlier in the 2000s, but he had reviewed and updated it. So I'll find it. I'll share a link.
Thanks.
Yeah, because definitely, I know there's some things we do well. We have lots of women in Techcom, but we are not a diverse profession at this point. So Miranda pointed out that's because of where our profession came from, which was engineering. So
how do you pronounce your name? Miranda?
Miranda.
Miranda. I saw you worked at GitHub, huh?
I did. I was a hubber.
Okay. I worked at Bitbucket for 5 years.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, so we had a very friendly rivalry with GitHub. Their offices were not far down the street from us, and so when they got acquired by Microsoft, we sent them a cake. It's like we had a very friendly rivalry with them. But they also have a very active ERG, and they, because they're kind of startup-y, they were small before they got acquired by Microsoft. They could afford to do some of the more agile stuff where their ERGs move much faster than Atlassian's did. So I always admired them from afar.
Thanks. Yeah, I worked there before the acquisition, so I departed just ahead. But it doesn't matter. I work for a company that's still owned by Microsoft, so it's like I can't escape. But were actually the first ERG at GitHub. So that was, to your point, they were very startup-ish.
Yeah.
They did a really good job, I think, not only of affecting the environment at GitHub, but they also did a lot to partner with the Black ERGs and all of a lot of ERGs that were in Silicon Valley, and did all kinds of things to just kind of spur, other people along, and like you said, just to kind of establish those connections. But it was great. It was the first ERG that I joined.
Yeah, the Black Atlassians group, at one point, before we actually had a name or anything, we were just a handful of Black folks getting together once in a while. We invited one of the owners, one of the co-founders of the group, MCB, Mike Cannon-Brooks, to come talk about. He wanted to have just a listening session where he basically, we had a round table of a bunch of us, and went all the way through, and Australians, they actually aren't super aware of a lot of the kind of really hard discussions around civil rights and terminology, language, and kind of the perils of being non-white in a majority white society. And so we kind of blew his mind with some things like he didn't understand the kind of caricature of the angry black man or the angry black woman. He's like, I'd never heard of such a thing before. All the black people I knew were quite friendly, and that never occurred to me. And of course, so we schooled him on a couple of things, and right away he realized like I need to do some more reading on this. Like it's like we uncovered a whole world that he had not ever been privy to. And he's kind of an admirer of black culture. Like he loves basketball, goes to NBA games, probably listens to hip hop music, dresses like he does, and has kids young enough so they probably have some sort of influence from the African American community.
Oh, you went mute.
Oh,
I can't hear you.
maybe a mic unplugged. Oh,
I can still hear y'all. Can y'all?
Okay, you're
I
here.
can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I mean, my favorite little clip that I've been saying. I want someone to prove me wrong, but at this point, because I have like almost 3,000 followers on Twitter, all because of Black Tech Twitter, it went viral one day, and I happened to be one of the first people who tweeted on it, and so got like a bunch of followers from that. And I did a podcast interview with Tom Johnson, and I did like 3 different podcast interviews over the past year or so. And I totally did a lot of traveling for my work as well. I did a bunch of presentations. I've been calling myself the most prominent black technical writer in the world, and I want someone to prove me wrong because I feel like I might be. I want that title. I know nobody likes to be the first. But
Category for myself then.
I want someone to prove me wrong.
White Fragility. I just finished reading that, and we did discussions on that. But I think that's just. I like that book because it puts a name to a lot of things that I've witnessed and experienced, and it's not like accusatory. It's not about like a big bucket of white guilt, kind of thing, but it really instead, it kind of gets into why. So instead of just saying, this is the situation and I really don't like it, instead it's like, well, why is that? And it talks about how, that the fact that white is just the default in society. So if that's something that spurs you along, you don't think about it because it's not in your face all the time if it's one of the things that's propelling you forward. So I highly recommend that book. I'm going to go turn my microphone off because Bethany knows that I can talk a whole lot, so I'm going to stop.
No. Well, I mean, yes, you can, but it's good.
This is a great conversation. I mean, I think it's courageous to even involve that because of the fact that it's just discomfort. And I think that's one of the things that we have to get comfortable with is having uncomfortable conversations. And that is really okay.
Yeah, it's an important thing to note that I am extremely uncomfortable talking about it in mixed company, and not because it's bad or harmful. I don't have any kind of traumatic experience. I mean, every minority's got traumatic experiences. We kind of all share that, but it's nothing out of the ordinary. But what makes my heart race is that, it's every time you talk about it, you have someone who wants to interject, and in some places there's no interjection needed. And the best example is that when I gave that pipeline talk for the first time, there was a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation, and someone conjured a quote from MLK. I could see him reading it from his phone. Conjured Dr. Martin Luther King quote saying, Dr. Martin Luther King says, "I wanted my children to be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. What do you have to say about that?" And I was, I'm on an emotional high, just giving the presentation of a lifetime, and here this man was basically taking the microphone, and the first question asked was this really insensitive question. And I didn't even think of it as insensitive at the time. I just kind of started trying to answer the question. And about 30 seconds into kind of stammering through what was a really insensitive question, I said, you know what, this is a really nuanced topic. If you want to talk about it further, come find me afterwards and we'll have a beer and talk about it. And in which case, I would tell him what I really think about his question, and I could be real honest with him without a microphone and my company's logo on my chest. But it just goes to show you that, we expect to be challenged on these things, and even when we prepare for it, it still is, not only is it frustrating, but it's nerve-wracking. You know, you're all of a sudden now I'm a representative of my people, and I never thought of myself that way. I'm just a regular human being, but because I'm the only person that looks like me here, now I am a representative of my people, and that kind of burden is it's unfair to expect that of people, but you know, it's something that most of us wear proudly, and we do so because we want to pave a way for other people that look like us. But
Yeah.
man, is it freaking stressful to have to be that person everywhere you go.
Yeah,
It's hard.
Explained, like, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I've had people come back with the, well, all lives matter. I said, that's very true. And but the fact, again, like that default, the fact that saying Black Lives Matter, no one ever said that other lives don't matter. But say, you know, that when people talk about the rainforest, no one comes back and says, oh, well, all forests matter.
Right.
No, we're talking about this particular forest because it's under a different level of threat. So it's really, that's the parallel that I've been giving people, because it's not that we're trying to amplify ourselves above anyone else. It's just really leveling the playing field, wanting things. It's equality and justice. It's not that we want some advantage that someone hasn't had. It's just that we want that same fair shot and not to have the headwinds facing us all the time.
But you know, Miranda, is it? I'm sorry, Miranda. So it's equality for me is table stakes. Like, we shouldn't have to argue about that. You know, we shouldn't have to argue about equal rights, equal justice, fair treatment. That should be something that comes out of the box. And I think it could be that I was raised by you know, baby boomers who grew up in the 70s and felt that, you know, they told me I could be anything from the moment I was born, and always was showered with love in a 2-parent household. Maybe I'm naive, but I've always expected equality. And when I didn't get it, I was always shocked that I had to ask for it. But to me, what's more important, and that to me never occurred, equality should be there already. But what's more important is equity. Like, when you come to these tech companies and they give me these, you know, stock options and, you know, kind of an inflated salary to cover cost of living, and I feel grateful. And when it feels like it's not enough, I feel ungrateful. But then I look at my colleagues and they buy houses in San Francisco, cash.
Wow.
$1 million. I'm working with millionaires, people who go to Tahoe on a whim. And you know, oh, they got snowed into Tahoe. Oh, they just spent another, you know, I spent another week in Tahoe. And I love to ski. So for me, seeing all my colleagues that go on a weekend and they don't have kids, so double, you know, they're double income, no kids, both engineers making $250,000 a year each, and own their own home and don't have any student loans. And you know, it's, you know, it's, I'm right to be envious, but at the same time, it's like I couldn't have ever done it that way, or it becomes, the challenge is to get to that level on the East Coast or in places where minorities more regularly live, and they don't have access to Berkeley or Stanford down the street, the most prominent computer science programs in the world. They don't just get hired out of college at $100,000 a year. It's unfathomable. So it's like, we need more, a seat at the table should be something like they should be asking for us to sit at the table. We shouldn't have to ask for that. But then when we get there, we don't just want to be there and be tokens. We want to have a say in something. We want our ideas to be respected and approved and funded and sponsored. We don't just seat at the table. To me, Miranda, is not enough. I want more than my seat at the table. I want my voice to be heard. And it's until there's managers that look like me, I don't think that I can aspire to be a manager anymore. Like, I've been at Atlassian for 5 years, and it's like, I don't know what else needs to happen. And it's not just there, it's every other company I worked at. Like, I've had one black manager in my entire 15-year tech writing career. And he was not really a technical writer. He was just an old military dude who just happened to still be there, and technical writing was what he picked up. Love that man to death. And he's the first person who ever gave me a shot at doing something outside my job role, but it was few and far between. So yeah, table stakes is a seat at the table. Now it's equality is table stakes. Now we want equity. We need to be able to improve our lives and improve the lives of everyone around us.
You know, I'm sorry. I remember when I was a teenager, my father owned his own small investment banking firm, and he raised eyebrows. This was in the 60s. He hired a young African-American man to join his sales staff. And my father was what you would call a Eisenhower Republican, very moderate, very business focused. He didn't seem to be the type that was, that would march in the Civil Rights March or something. But he stood by his decision to hire this young man because to him, nothing else mattered. But the guy was going to be a good salesman, and that's all my father cared about. And when he went to a convention, a sales convention at the company that he had worked for previously, he drew attention from young people who were minorities. I mean, they kind of flocked to my father because they knew that he didn't care about anything else but whether they had potential as salespeople. And that was really pretty, that's what I grew up with. It's just, color just was something like the shirt you were wearing or your eye color or anything else. And I think it's very tragic that we have to, work through this so hard, and I really wish that, everyone else could have had the upbringing that I did, but unfortunately they didn't, and it makes things very difficult.
Yeah, but you had that experience, and it's important that racism can't be solved by Black people.
No,
we're not responsible for racism. We didn't create it. We don't benefit from it. The responsibility to defeat it has had to come from allies, from white allies. And it's important that people realize that it's okay to talk about race. No one wants to talk about it all the time. It's uncomfortable, but everyone plays a role.
Yeah,
it's the suffrage movement. It's not that, what if someone would have said, back in the day, like, oh, it has to be, women have to grant themselves the right to vote. Like, well, if we could, we have. But,
right.
At this point, it has to be definitive steps from the people who are in power, who have authority. That's how those changes occur.
And so,
the thing that's interesting is so much of it's ignorance, and then it's belligerence on top of ignorance. Like I find, I cringe at these discussions when I hear white people say things like all lives matter, because I think, where have you been for the last 30 or 40 years? Like it doesn't take much to understand where this is coming from. And I just think it was going back to something Rhonda was saying earlier. We're sort of taught history, even recent history, as white history is the default. And, it's old white men. And then we have like Black History Month or Women's History Month. Well, that's not really the story. And it's always about who we are as a people. And that's everybody. And as long as we tend to think of white men as our history, and then everybody else has a little 5 minutes, I think we're running into this because it's just weird. Like I can't imagine responding or being threatened by someone saying Black Lives Matter, because but I also am aware of where it's coming from. Like because I know my history, and I consider it American history. Like this is it's very important what we've been through. And I just think people I don't know, I think they just don't, they think, well, you're talking about some other thing, not us or something. It's like, well, it's not us, it's all one history. We're one people with a lot of problems getting along with each other.
And in conjunction with that, one of the things that really kind of amazed me about how much is missing from our history is that I wanted to do some research on the history of the United States Navy, because my father was a pilot in the Navy, and I just wanted to find out a little bit more about that tradition that he had come from. And in my, poking around, I found out tons of stuff about African American troops that had fought all the way back to the Civil War that we know nothing about. The Harlem Hellfighters in World War I, the 54th Massachusetts, which was, their story was told in the movie Glory. But there are tons and tons more stories like that about heroes of other races. And I don't know how long it's going to take for us to hear their stories, but it truly amazed me. It really did.
And how integral, that when you were mentioning World War II, I was just thinking of diversity. One of the key factors in our victory was that we were able to code messages in Navajo.
Yes.
And that the Europeans had never heard, and that was a huge part
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's not like a separate let's have diversity day. It's like, hey, thank God we had this diversity, or we wouldn't have won the war. I mean, I guess it's like it bothers me that it's sort of on the side, because it enables people to think, well, you're just coming at me from left field, and that part of it's not important. Yeah, which is weird, just weird.
Well, yeah, and if I could add something, Jessica, I've had a few recent conversations with this about friends talking about white privilege. One of the things that I think we feel comfortable with is saying that people who are racist exist, but it's so much harder to say racism as built into in all of our systems, our economics.
Oh, yeah.
Is everywhere. And it's easier to say, well, that person's racist, and if they weren't, then that would help solve the problem. And that's just something that I think is hard for people to wrap their heads around, because if you're not being oppressed by racism, then it's easy to say, well, I don't know anyone who's racist. Those are other people.
Yeah,
they're online. I don't know them. And
yeah, that's true. It's really hard coded into our society, which is very sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm probably unintentionally racist, and I'm trying to unlearn that. It's hard.
You're saying in like, we all have these biases or internalized things or assumptions.
Yeah, we all have our assumptions, and trying to identify them and then unlearn them, that's really hard, but it's worth it.
I have to admit, you guys are spot on, and that myself, actually, I have a recent example where I had to I checked myself. And actually, funny, when preparing for this meeting, Alex asked me, "Is your handle still Tech Writer Ninja?" Because that used to be my handle for a long time, and pretty much everything, including Twitter. I actually changed it recently to what I now is Senior Content Design. And in no small part, I read an article that talked about the kind of cultural appropriation of the word ninja, especially by people in the tech industry. Like, oh, I'm a code ninja, and it's kind of meant to be a term of endearment, talking about you have proficiency in something. But the author of this article, who was Southeast Asian, he says, nobody wants to be a caricature, nobody wants to be your costume, and you don't get to wear someone else's culture as your costume. And it hit me right there. So I had to change my handle, and I didn't make a blog post about it. I didn't. This is probably the only time I've ever talked on the record about it ever. Because what I did was I recognized that this thing that I thought was pretty funny and cool was probably not as funny and cool as I thought it was. And while it might be descriptive of what I do, it might even kind of insinuate that I'm a techie who does tech writing. I don't want to be associated with that, and it doesn't cost me anything to be more creative and think of a different name. And so I did, and I felt absolutely no consequences. I think my mom had a hard time finding one of my tweets because it was attached to my old name. But aside that, people will find you. They will find whatever, make the change. Don't wait for someone to point you out and call you out. You know what I mean? Like if you find out, it's like, oh, damn, that thing I did, it's not a good look. I'm going to try to be better about that. It's just, I'm going to be better. And you don't have to get a pat on the back. No one needs to recognize you for it. You know that you're trying to do better. And that's all that's really important, is that we all take personal responsibility. And then what that manifests into is kind of this allyship, this alliance that where the kind of inhumane treatment of somebody would never fly. We'll never sit by and watch somebody just be racist or sexist or homophobic or any of that. That's not going to fly, because we all internalize that anti-racism, that anti-homophobic behavior, the anti-Semite inside you. We internalize that, and then it becomes like I want to make racists scared again. They should be afraid to be racist in public.
Yeah, there's that absolutely true. I remember in 1960, I'm old enough to remember the year 1964. I know I'm really aging myself, but that was the year that the Civil Rights Bill was signed into law by President Johnson. And I remember the day we found out that Johnson had signed the law, my sister and I were cheering and jumping up and down, yippee, civil rights. And the sad part that we found out after all this time is that yes, that was definitely a step in the right direction, but it did not solve the racism problem, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that more than ever now. And we have so much work to do, even though, you know, we did take those important steps back in the 60s, but it was only a very small part of a very big problem.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
I think this has been an amazing conversation. And now, John, that you're back in Florida, this is now the Florida chapter. This is this can be your home if you want it. No, we hope to be able to lean on you now that you're back home, and for your expertise and for your stewardship and everything. So, well, we do want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Alex. It's always a pleasure to talk to you in particular, and this group that is near and dear to my heart. So I'll come back anytime.
And does anybody else have any anything else that they want to share, or any questions, or?
I'm always happy to get in touch. LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, all that. I'll send my LinkedIn up too.
Thank you for your thoughtful commentary.
My pleasure. And if